of you that just joined. Thank you guys for making the time to talk with us today. We're super excited about the discussion and sharing a lot of the learnings from just the general AppSec market. My name is Pete Martin. I oversee the enterprise sales team for Rapid7 on the West Coast, and I'm joined by a few colleagues. I think one of our colleagues is running a minute or two late, so we may proceed without him. But we will go ahead and get into some of the introductions here. All right. So as I said, my name is Pete Martin. Been with Rapid7 for going on 2 years this go around. I worked here for about 4 years back in 2011. The antithesis for this webinar and this discussion really revolves around a handful of our more sophisticated customers that we've been working with for 5 to 6 years now, and really building out, maturing, and helping them get to scale as it really relates to application security. As you can imagine, on the West Coast, there's a lot of tech companies who have countless applications, but a lot of real constraints as far as resources, expertise, time, all that fun stuff. So today, we're excited to really share with you, what we've been learning in the space and what we're helping customers achieve from an AppSec perspective. Just to be super clear, the point of this discussion is not really to push product or talk about Rapid7. Tim and Dave, who will introduce themselves shortly here, they've been talking to customers about this stuff for years and years and years. And there's a lot of stuff that doesn't even involve Rapid7 that we're excited to talk about and share. So I enthuse everyone to post any questions that you might have as they come up, and we'll kind of take it as we go. Tim, do you want to do a quick introduction, and then Dave after, if you're on?
Yeah, sure. So hi, everyone. My name's Tim Honker. I'm a lead solutions engineer for the West Coast. I serve our enterprise customers, all of the large cloud providers, operating system companies, social networks. All of those are my customers and prospects on a daily basis. I help them solve a variety of security problems with our products and services. I've been with Rapid7 for about 4 years. I've been in security for 10 years, and I got into security in high school when I hacked the grading system and got suspended. And I was a developer, and that's really what today's about is AppSec. But I was a developer for over 10 years out of college, and then switched into security eventually. And Dave, were you able to join us? I'm not sure if he's made it in yet. He might be running late. So Dave Howe, who will be joining us later, is our chief AppSec specialist. He's a pen tester, he's a security researcher, and he is a guru of all things AppSec and security in general. But I can go ahead and get started. Pete, was there anything else?
Thing, Tim. Yeah, just one quick thing, if you mind going back. So that picture there, that was week 2 of social distancing, and we're on week 3 or 4 now. So use your imagination, and you can probably guess what I look like now. That was 2 weeks ago.
These were placeholder images I put in the presentation a while ago, and they said no, leave them in. So yeah, this is one, and that's Dave on the right. All right. Anything else, Pete?
No. I would just say, we have a medium-sized group. Like, it's not too large. It's not super small, but legitimately any questions are good questions, and I'm going to be taking some notes on the side. So put any questions you have in the chat, and we will get to them as they come up. But with that, Tim, feel free to get into the content.
Great. So today is all about summarizing the information we've learned from our other enterprise customers and helping large companies advance their probably already intermediate AppSec programs. We'll be touching on some basics too, but it's about creating a self-service web portal for your app, for your developers, facing the more advanced challenges and overcoming them in an AppSec program. So we'll start out talking about what have we seen out in the industry in the last 12 months that are patterns and problems? What's the state of AppSec in the enterprise space today? And then what are the problems we're seeing, and then how do we move past them? And then we'll talk about how to build and effectively run a mature enterprise AppSec program. So we divide things up into a few different categories: immature, maturing, and mature. And today's presentation is largely about moving that last step into the mature category. Then we'll summarize things and we'll have Q&A, but don't hesitate to ask questions as we go and type them into the chat, and Pete will run them by me and we can come deal with things as they come up. So thank you so much for joining. So where are things today with AppSec? So what we've noticed over the past year, and especially in this past quarter, we're still seeing AppSec tools struggle to keep up with modern technologies. Devs are continuing to move things out to the cloud. I start getting asked questions about, do you guys scan infrastructure as code? Do you support these new cloud services? What about microservices? Hey, I have this funny new authentication method for APIs. We're seeing that continuously come up and be a struggle for everyone. Always sitting around and always there, friction in the remediation process with developers. We see, and we'll go into symptoms of these and solutions and how to implement fixes for these later in the presentation. So we see AppSec tools really like failing to deliver on a high level of what they promise. We see a lot of false positive and false negatives across the board. And I'm not just, I mean, Rapid7, yeah, we have some solutions out there, but I'm talking about the industry as a whole today. I'm not here to sell Rapid7 products. I'm here to just give general guidance. Like I mentioned earlier, APIs are getting more and more popular, microservice infrastructures, and people are starting to implement more secure API authentication methods like Amazon has, and tools are really struggling to work with that. Security teams often underestimate how long it takes to onboard new apps. There's been a number of customers, enterprise customers that I've talked to that have said, oh, hey, I really like your product or whatever. Can I get a quote for 3,500 apps? And I stop and say, you have time to implement, to start, configure and scan 3,500 apps in 12 months. And they're underestimating how much time it takes to onboard these new apps and what the process might look like. Almost every POC I run, the security department doesn't have an accurate list of what technologies these apps are built on, what authentication methods they use, what server-side and client technologies they're using. I would say 90% of my POCs, there's something missing there that was important. And then from the attacker's perspective, half of all the enterprises out there are claiming that the application, their websites are actually being attacked more frequently than layers 3 and 4 on the network. So this is getting to be a more and more popular method in, like we saw with Equifax. So, like I said, we divide maturity up generally in the market into 3 categories: immature, maturing, and mature. So what we've seen, so I'm the lead for the West Coast, so I help out with mid-market and named opportunities as well, actually across the country. So I see from really immature to super mature programs across the board. So what do I see trending in the immature programs? The first thing is security doesn't have the backing of leadership, and therefore they get a really tense relationship between developer and security. It can be combative. I've had multiple companies tell me that they were not on speaking terms with the development teams. They would pass each other on the hall and they would not speak to each other because things were so bad between them. I hear the word powerless a lot. Security teams saying, well, we scan these things, but we're just powerless to make them do anything, or they won't listen to us. Security teams in these situations are usually focused on scanning production, on a quarterly or annual basis, or just before major releases, and releases are a big deal to them still. We see reporting based on individual scans a moment in time, and then they have to compare that between different scans, or an API scan versus a macro scan versus whatever else. We're not seeing ticketing system integrations. People are doing everything manually, and they really lack a person who has a whole lot of experience with AppSec itself. So that's kind of what we're seeing on the low level of maturity. On the mid level of maturity, in the maturing category, we see functional, we see serviceable relationships. I see, we get along, we're strapped for people. This is probably the most common category that I see out there. There's still a lot of friction around remediation, and the security team is heavily involved in remediation still. So it's really killing efficiency when you've got dozens or hundreds of development teams reaching out and contacting security for help because they can't be independent yet. And security team is really the bottleneck for these scans because they have to be really hands-on and involved with everything. You start to see a shift from scan level reporting to application level. So If an app is built out of half a dozen APIs or microservices, they can combine all of that information into one app, but they're struggling on larger scale reporting beyond that. There's a decent amount of overlap between the knowledge that the security team has and the development team. So they kind of speak the same language, but they can't truly communicate and they don't fully understand each other yet. And you start to see security get integrated somewhat into the CI/CD pipeline. And then the top level, my enterprise customers that have really built things out in terms of people, process, and technology, the main thing that differentiates them for me is that they've made security part of the culture. And the business owners, the C levels, are truly invested in security and they're preaching it on a daily basis. They're telling product, they're telling development and QA, hey, this is important. This must be from the get-go part of architecting the program, part of the development process, and tests must be done as we go.
And just to add a little bit of context on this, this is maybe like the 1%. And it's not that everyone is able to achieve these different benchmarks or this level of efficacy or success across the board. Everyone's got strengths and weaknesses. And what we typically find is the organizations that can reduce the need for person-to-person interaction between development and security are able to remove friction and increase scale. And I know that sounds kind of like common sense, but you know, one of the things that we're going to get into in a bit is how do you give development the flexibility and freedom to ultimately achieve what you want, but do it in a way that works on their terms. And obviously a lot of that is integrating with their systems and so on and so forth. But I thought that context might be helpful.
Yeah, it's all about meeting development where they are. They should give a little bit in terms of learning some security, but you know, security, we're here to help out the developers and support the business. So at this stage, you know, the higher ups, they're invested in security. The relationship becomes symbiotic. Both sides have each other's back. One of the big things that everyone struggles with, and we'll get into this more in detail, is discovery. By this stage, enterprises have an accurate inventory of all of their apps and what they're built out of. And you know, in the less mature stages, when it's a really fraught relationship, there's a lot of friction. By this stage, if you know, developers, I've had security professionals tell me, you know what, if a developer sees a Slack message from me, or if I go over and I talk to them, they take it really seriously because it's rare for us to interact, and they know, oh man, if security's talking to me, this is serious and I really need to engage. So they take it real seriously. I also see things largely are fully automated at this point, and we'll dig into more of that in detail. A big differentiating factor for me is when releases become mundane. When you're talking to a company and they say, oh, we've got a big release coming up, we can't do anything right now. I know that they're in one of the lower stages of development process of like maturity. When I talk to larger companies like entertainment providers, like streaming services or online gaming providers, and they release 2 or 3 times a day, releases become very mundane. They're not a big deal anymore because process has been really optimized and is highly efficient. And so they're not worried every time a release happens because it happens a couple times a day for them. So larger companies tend to, or more mature organizations start reporting on many levels. I was talking with a large networking provider over the past few weeks, and what they were looking for and working towards is they had technical metrics, they had operational metrics on their AppSec program, but they wanted to continue to build out 4 or 5 different levels of executive reporting that reported on various different business units, on app categories, and organize things a bunch of different ways. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. And then finally, the last stage that I would say inside of this category that I see is once the company starts to build a self-service portal for developers. Once they enable the developers and build a tool for them to do this pretty much all on their own, then you've really reached the finish line in terms of maturity. There's always little things to improve, but that's like really the sign to me that someone is taking it really seriously when the process is so automated and they've built internal tools around this. So, Pete, unless you had anything you wanted to add, I can go on to the next category.
Yeah, no, all good.
Okay, so just wrapping up, and I'm gonna run through these quickly in case there's people who work for organizations that are on maybe the immature or maturing side of things. They're not familiar with all the different categories of AppSec tools. So we'll run them down. SAST is one of the older ones. I equate this to scanning DNA, like a 23andMe test. You are scanning vulnerabilities at their source. It's really easy for developers to find vulnerabilities. The great thing about SAST is it talks to developers in a language that they understand. It can integrate directly into their IDE, like Visual Studio. I would love a button to push in Visual Studio to say, hey, scan my code and tell me where the problems are. The great thing about this is it is the most cost-effective version of AppSec because it's 35 times cheaper to find the vulnerability at this stage as soon as the developer types it in than it is until it gets to production and it's live out on the internet. So 35 times cheaper. We'll hit that number again later, but that's a huge selling point to go for a SAST tool. So weaknesses, they tend to have a higher false positive rate. It has to be super tied to what technology you're using. It may not scale, and it doesn't protect you during runtime. It's just purely a prevention control in the development process. So one of the other tools that is often paired with it is a DAST tool. So dynamic application scanners will go in and they basically provide broad coverage. They will attack the app. They act just like an attacker. Think Burp Suite, but automated. And it goes in, it crawls the app and throws the kitchen sink at it. DASTs are all about making sure that you don't run into the OWASP top 10 by the time you get to a pen test later and things. So they provide better false positive, false negative rates. They act just like an attacker. They simulate attackers. They can be integrated into your CI/CD process. The problem is now these things are great for security teams because it's more of a point and shoot sort of thing. But devs, oftentimes these things aren't made to where devs can understand the reports very easily. And the devs will struggle to interpret, especially retest. You know, devs aren't pen testers. They don't know how to retest these things. So one of the lifts becomes, okay, well, I have to log into this other tool. I have to trigger a scan, and I don't know how to configure things, or I have to wait an hour before I know whether or not I fixed it. DASTs can also, one of the chief things that I run into is support for modern frameworks. If a JavaScript framework just came out last month and your development team got all happy and excited about it and said, we're going to use that. Well, chances are no DAST out there is going to support it. No SAST out there is going to support it. It's a brand new technology. You're not going to be able to automatically find vulns for it. And that's where pen testing comes in useful. And DASTs, when they're poorly tuned, can lack coverage and they can take a really long time to scan if you don't have somebody tuning them for different apps. The last one on this slide before I move on some of the other is IAST. IAST is kind of a combination of the two of these where you run unit tests. It's not super widely adopted. It requires support on both the SAST and DAST side for the technologies, and you do have to deploy an agent. Then there's WAFs. WAFs are super popular. They've been around for a long time too. Web application firewalls are great for protecting your production machines. They can block attacks live out there on the internet or detect them and alert you about things. They don't intrude on the development process, so development loves that. And depending on which one you have, it can even absorb DDoS attacks. So if you're getting a distributed denial of service attack, some WAFs can't absorb that. Drawbacks, really the two big ones are alert fatigue. WAFs tend to fire off a lot of alerts. And then number two is now you are in the game of security research, which you may not want to be in, especially if you're not a super huge company that has a department dedicated to that. So you are constantly doing research to find out what attacks are popular, how are people evading WAFs, and then you have to implement regular expressions and rules to constantly update that rule list. And that is a real pain. So a ton of false positives and a constant need to maintain that rule list. And I'll just stop for a second and take a breather. You guys are welcome to type in questions if you have anything. We'll be getting into the more like mature stuff after this section. But you guys are welcome to type in questions when you have them.
Yeah, Tim, just to give you a second to catch your breath, just to speak to the DAST side, given that is an area of security we can help cover. One of the common challenges with DAST is not really understanding how deep and far the actual scan was able to get into the applications. We have a lot of people who use a bunch of different technologies, and a lot of times they think because the scanner came back with no vulnerabilities or no issues that there truly are no issues. One of the things to understand is the ability to map out the actual traffic flow of the application so that you can cross-reference the findings with how far into the application you were actually able to get, because a lot of older technologies, if they aren't able to get an authentication, they stop crawling, and you end up getting a partial scan. So just one thing that we see quite often with DAST scanning.
Absolutely. So yeah, we do sell a DAST scanner, but we also sell, and today's not about selling, but I'm also closely familiar with RASP technologies. This is newer. There are kind of a variety of different types here, but to consolidate their strengths and weaknesses, RASP, for those of you familiar with like Cylance or Carbon Black, that's more like an operating system protection for processes, right? It spies on processes as they run, watches, did something exploit something? Did it scrape the memory for hashes? What was it doing behaviorally? I'm going to block that based off of the behavior. So RASP is kind of like that, but for the actual web application process and the traffic that's coming in using an agent. Now, downside, you have to install an agent, but it will watch for SQL, like SQL injection, detect functions that are accessing tables they don't normally access, like the list of passwords, and can block that activity. So it's great at RASP tools are really great at detecting advanced attacks that other tools can't catch. Some of them can even find and block 0 days. They tend to have fewer false positives because they're running as close to the code as possible in the runtime. They're literally running, well, at least ours T-cell runs inside like the Java container. It's bolted onto the side of it. And so it can see all of the memory access, all of the functions getting called, all of the stack traces. RASPs are pretty hard to evade, but one of the downsides is you can only catch things when they're being exercised. It's not a prevention control ahead of time unless you combine it with a DAST. Drawbacks: requires an agent. Some of those agents out there have performance hits, so operations teams really hate that. Like any tool, it can take time to tune it, and there's not support for every language out there. So if your developers are writing an app in Go, there may not be an agent that supports Go for that web application. And then finally, SCA. No, it's not back from the 90s. It's not dancing. SCA is software composition analysis. So no need to bust out your checker colored tie and do some skanking. You can, SCA is all about finding vulns in third-party libraries. So like I said earlier, developers get really excited about the new and hot JavaScript libraries or frameworks that come out every month. And it can save them a bunch of time. So, oh, hey, why invent the wheel when I can go and I can buy this pre-made toolbox? Well, sometimes those toolboxes that you're using on your servers or the client side can be exploited too. You're importing third-party code, so that could be importing vulnerabilities too. So what we need is a tool that scans and finds vulnerabilities that are introduced to us by using other third-party code. So it catches risk early. It's super easy for the developers to understand. It can even automate remediation. It's easy and smooth for the developers to fit into their existing process. It's kind of closer to a SAST. The problems are, if there's not a patch available, if it's just a vulnerable library, that's it. You found a vuln, but there's no way to patch it. And it only finds known vulnerabilities. So CVEs, not like a lot of the rest of these tools will find CWEs, which are the broad general category like SQL injection or cross-site scripting. SCA will find known vulns in known libraries out there. And then finally, last and king of them all is the pen test. Nothing beats a pen test. Humans are going to be more creative. This should be the last thing, right? You should be starting with SCA and SAST and then maybe running DAST and IAST after that. And you always need to have like overlapping controls. That's a key point of defense in depth. Have overlapping controls so that you can make sure you catch things. The pen test should be the last thing run. And as one of my prospects said recently, I don't want to catch anything in the OWASP top 10 in my pen test. The automated tools should be taking care of that. I should only be finding business logic abuse and really complicated things. If you're a pen tester into web application security, you probably should be playing around or have played around with Juice Shop. Is a great single page application. And it has some really complex vulnerabilities that have to be tied together in order to really exploit and gain control of the server. Those are things that automated tools cannot catch because they're super creative and complex and require guessing. So pen tests will find that stuff. Downsides, they're expensive. You might have to wait a while to schedule one. And you can't, even with a team of 3 or 5 people, you can only cover several dozen apps per year. You know, you're going to spend 1 to 3 weeks on every app. So you just can't cover as much. And you're going to have to hire some full-time pen testers, or you'll have to outsource it. So that wraps up a summary of all the different AppSec technologies, all the most common ones that are out there today. And you guys are welcome to type in questions. Thanks, Jen. So we'll move on to, I know from the list here, I recognize some names. I know some of you work in the enterprise space. You run AppSec programs. What problems you guys are facing, but also how to fix them. So we summarize some of the maturity stuff, but here's where some of the advice comes in. So the number one thing, the granddaddy of all of them, is the lack of ownership of an asset program. All the other problems we talk about in here are pretty much derived from this one problem. And as I mentioned up top, if leadership doesn't have your back, if leadership isn't preaching security, you're going to have a lot of other problems downstream because of that. So what are some signs that this is going on in your organization? Security seen as a bolt-on. Other business units don't understand why security exists. You can't get buy-in from them. You have no political power. It's super common, unfortunately. So like I said, you need to get leadership behind you. You need to have the business unit should be leading the workflows. It shouldn't be security driving the charge. Security should be backing them up and supporting them, but the business units should be fully invested and understand why security is important to them. So I learned this a while ago. Before I got married, I went to premarital counseling. And one of the things that I really took away from that was seek first to understand and then be understood. And that's been super useful for work relationships as well. If you want to get somebody else in a department to do something, the first thing you have to do is to understand them and make sure that they feel understood. You know, security usually seen as the department of no. We go around, we hit people over the head with bats and force them into submission. That's not the way to go about business and really affect change. So, okay, yeah, we'll talk about containers in a little bit. So instead, understand development and the business. So you have to, first of all, sit down and understand, how does my business operate? I need to go talk to these other departments. What apps are they relying on? What protocols? Where is the data flowing that I need to protect? Which apps are the most important? And I can focus first on those. Then another trick that I learned, I've been dealing with salespeople for the last 10 years, is frame everything about how it's beneficial for them. Hey, here's this thing that I want you to do. And instead of saying, this is why we need to do it because it secures the data, I'm going to frame it instead of, hey, I'm going to help you. I have this good thing that we should do together, and it's going to be good for you for reasons 1, 2, and 3. And they go, oh yeah. So framing things as how it's going to be good for the business and good for the developers and make their jobs easier and make them more money and make them leaner and faster is going to really get the backing of the business a lot more, because you'll understand the business and you show, hey, I am here to support the business. Another thing that one of my enterprise customers said to me recently was, you really need to treat the different business units like they're an external customer, almost like you work for another company and you're providing a service for them. You're there to make them happy. You're there to make sure that they're successful. And then one of the other things, this is going to be a drum that I beat a lot, is defining really clear process for onboarding new apps. If it's super vague, then it's going to be hard to scale. If you don't have a proper inventory of things, then you don't know what to protect. So having a really defined process for, hey, this department wrote a new app, they should know exactly what to do and where to go to log it and make sure it gets into the system, and that you guys can prioritize it accordingly and scan it and find the vulns. Okay. One of the people in the chat said container image scans versus runtime scans. So I'll just I'll touch on that right now. So container image scans, there are a variety of different types of risk that can pop up in your organization, and that could be risk from third-party libraries. It could be packages for the operating system or third-party software that's installed with CVEs. It could be deployments of your application into containers. So depending on what you're looking for, you may need a traditional vuln management tool. The vuln management providers out there, all the big three, have container scanners. When you're shopping for them and talking to vendors, make sure you're asking whether or not, two things. Number one, are they scanning for the containers live as they're running? And number two, can I integrate it into my CI/CD process to where as soon as someone checks in a container from the development team, can I trigger a scan on it before it ever goes live? And then I guess number three is I need to know about remediation advice. Container remediation advice is completely different from traditional vuln management because there are layers and packages involved. It's all in developer speak. So if you try to write remediation guidance that's listed like it's an IT team, then the developer's not going to understand it. So there are some other great tools like Sneak out there that we've partnered with that have great coverage for this sort of stuff of, hey, let's scan containers as soon as they're checked in. Let's give automated advice that's understandable by the developers. Hey, change line 3 in this compose file to include a different version. And so the developer knows exactly what to do. Does that answer your question? I guess you wanted to know about container image scans versus runtime scans. So image scans usually just look at the package manifest in the Docker Compose file. They will take inventory and say, okay, here's what packages you've installed on various layers. Therefore, I'm going to map that to CVEs. That's going to be before runtime. Then runtime scans are going to, they can either do that or they can talk to the container through the Docker service and then scan to see what's inside and what's actually running and check the file system. Containers should be immutable. They should be not changing when they're deployed, but not everyone follows best practices. So looking for configuration changes after the fact would be a more advanced practice that hopefully no one's doing, but it would be a more advanced way to catch things. So ideally, they shouldn't produce different results, but sometimes a bad DevOps department would be making changes to a container at runtime.
Yeah, and Tim, I'm not sure if you saw the feedback, but it seems like you got it. So thank you for asking the question.
Thanks. I love rambling about security for long periods of time.
Well, it's good that everyone's muted because no one can interrupt you. That's great.
Yes, I love it. So, all right. So the problem number one that we faced was lack of ownership of that asset program. The security doesn't, or leadership doesn't have security's back. And no one really is taking charge of that and leading it. Number two, I would say, is inventory. This is classic CIS benchmarking steps, kind of 3, 4, and 5, I think. You can only protect what you know you have. And so, I see this in POCs. How many apps do you have? I don't know. Okay, what are they built on? I think they're mostly .NET. Okay, what's the tech stack? What, is it Jenkins? Is it Azure DevOps? What do is it Ansible? Are you building it in AWS and building AMIs? I don't know. Well, that's important information that security teams do need to know. They need to know what the software is made up of, but also what technologies are used to build it through that pipeline. So what do you do to get this information? You create an app catalog. App catalog is a web application or a CMDB plugin that keeps a list of what web applications and APIs and microservices do we have? Where are they running? What are they built from? Who are the owners of them? Who's the tech owner? Who's the business owner? Who's the product manager of that thing? Who do I contact when I find something? Also, you can perform internal and external app discovery. So you could use like a vuln management tool to look for things that have web servers open, or you could use Shodan or Rapid7's Open Project Sonar to find all of your web servers, because developers are going to leave ones out there running on AWS that get forgotten about, and that could be an entry point into your organization. One of the other questions to ask on this questionnaire when you're creating your app catalog, when someone adds to the inventory, is, what data is being handled? And the security team should make a decision and say, you know what, this is a high risk application. We're going to move it into a different category. It's going to get pen tested every quarter. It's going to go through different processes. We're going to consider any vulns critical on this application. And so how do you go about doing that? Well, like I already alluded to, you create an onboarding questionnaire, and this is what my enterprise customers do. And when I get to the architecture slide at the end of the presentation, I'll show you exactly what this workflow looks like. But when you have this questionnaire, it's a web form, and you could start off with Google Forms. I don't care. Just get an inventory out there. Security teams sit down, create a list of questions of what do you need to know in order to protect these things. And that would be like, who are the owners of it, not only on a technical basis, but a business level? What's it built with? What languages is it using? What versions of PHP are being used? How is it being authenticated to? And then really sit down and take some time to learn these application architectures. I'll talk about it later, but we have to meet developers where they are and learn how they do their job. And I took a class, I stopped actively developing day-to-day about 10 years ago. And last summer, I took a couple of classes online from A Cloud Guru, and it was $30 a month. And I got a couple of certifications in AWS. And now I understand AWS architectures and how to securely deploy things. And that was really useful in having AWS conversations later on when I started to get asked questions about Ansible or a variety of DevOps pipelines, golden AMIs, Lambda functions, and a lot of new technology out there that's being created that if you don't understand how it works, you really can't secure it, because cloud stuff operates very differently than the traditional stuff. So that's, you have to have a list of what you're going to protect. Also, scaling's a huge problem. They're not going to ever give you enough people that you need, and everyone's understaffed always. Suddenly the security team, I've talked to a variety of companies in every sector, but I'll pick on healthcare. A healthcare company that I was working with acquired another smaller healthcare company, and they suddenly onboarded 3,000 new apps. And a lot of them were super, super old. They didn't have a proper list of them or what they were made out of or where they were from. So they didn't have an app catalog. And they were suddenly in charge of securing all of them. The business didn't understand how AppSec worked. And so they said, well, just give, we have an application security team. Just, they're already scanning 500 apps. Just give them the other 3,000. It'll be fine. So you can't scale with personnel, really. You have to start using technologies. And here is, especially in mergers and acquisitions territory, when I deal with large cloud providers that are acquiring smaller point solutions to build into their platform, or operating system providers, they're, I'll pick on Microsoft, for example. In no way am I talking about what they're doing, but if Microsoft acquires a company, they might have built stuff that uses Linux or a variety of other tools out there, or authentication methods that aren't on Microsoft's top 10. And what Microsoft does is they bring them into the fold and they force them to conform to a smaller set of acceptable programming languages, JavaScript frameworks, authentication methods, and they rewrite and modify these apps to where they fit within the normal tech stack. And that allows people to scale a lot easier. So in order to solve this, you can't have security own the ownership, instead the dev teams and the business owners, because we'll never have enough people in the security department. And another thing you can do that we'll be talking about in detail is build that self-service web portal. Enable the developers to work independently of you so that they don't need you when they have every little question that comes along, or ask you to run a rescan, or how do I do this, or what does this mean, or I don't believe that this is real, prove it to me. So how do you go about doing that? Well, the first step is talk to each of the development teams, work with them, get at least one of them fully on board with what you're trying to do, and designate a champion and say that person's in charge of security. Even though they don't work for the security department, they're going to be the security champion for that development team. Meet developers where they are. Instead of, developers hate logging into more tools. They already have dozens of tabs open for different tools. They don't want to log into more tools. So if you can meet them where they are, and if they're using Jira, fine. You never have to log into these tools. You can just do everything through the Jira. Try to integrate with their existing tech stack and not give them an extra thing to log into. Try to avoid that if you can. You also need to do risk prioritization. So for step one, or one of the steps earlier was app catalog, business context of the application and risk with the application. You're gonna have to filter things. Forget about the lows and informationals. Just forget about them. That's 90% of your findings. You'll never fix them. They don't matter. Focus on the likelihood of exploitation and the business risk, and focus on your highs and mediums for your CWEs. Target to those findings on just the critical apps. You're going to largely use unauthenticated scans in this space. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but you need to standardize your development process. Everyone's using the same process. Everyone's using Jenkins. Everyone's using Angular version 7. And when you simplify like that, it makes things a lot easier to scale because you don't have to have experts on all of these different areas. So for example, let's say a big cloud provider, they make 2,000 different apps, and they only support 4 methods for authentication. Every app in the company has to use one of these 4 apps. That actually makes it really easy to scale when you get to, like, say, DAST scanning, because you can have pre-made workflows that work with those 4 different methods of authentication. It makes it a lot easier to scan when you do that than we might have 25 different authentication methods in the company. It makes it really hard to scale a lot of the AppSec tools that we're using.
Yeah. Tim,
Tim, and I just want, go ahead, Dave. No, go ahead.
Talked about before in the last slide around, security not knowing, what they need to, right? The inverse is also correct in this, right? Developers are developing things for their end users, right? When you look at how the web apps have evolved from 1.0 to 2.0 and 3.0 type of applications, the big shift has been, how do I make things easier for my end user? That's when they're introducing things like advanced frameworks like Angular and stuff. But what's not being taken into account is, how does this affect my security posture? Does this create issues with how I'm able to actually identify and find vulns? And so this whole thing of interviewing with your developers, really starting to bring them and keep them in the tools that they do, is about creating that real understanding of that security is part of their dev practices and not this other thing that they have to do to get their application published. So it's really good to, when you're looking at scaling this, that you bring that back into those practices as well to really make this organic, and that it's a loop between the two teams, that they feel like they're part of a family and not dispirited groups that are working against each other.
Good point.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great commentary. Yeah. Tim, just want to give you some feedback. We got about 40 minutes left. So just want to make sure you have enough time for some of the self-service architecture and all that.
Great. Thanks for the heads up. I'll move a little bit quicker through the next couple slides. So how do you scale? You designate owners, you standardize your process. How do you integrate with the SDLC? People are already struggling to meet deadlines. Devs don't want another tool to log into. Like I said earlier, frame it as, here's something I can do to help you guys more efficient. And instead of being an enforcing cop, be the helpful parent that enables them. And one of the things that really resonated with me as a former developer is, hey, we found these things that would likely lead to runtime errors or crashes. And I went, oh, I need to fix that. Because bots are going to be coming after your network. They're going to be fuzzing and inserting junk into forms all over the place. I don't want all my web servers going down, even though it wasn't a successful attack. They didn't steal credit card numbers. I can't have my website go down from jerks doing that sort of stuff. Developers may not care about theft of sensitive data, but they do care about runtime errors and crashes. Like I said at the beginning with SDLC, hey, development managers, how would you like to pay 35 times less for security? Hey, let's try to shift this as early as possible and make it as painless as possible. And also get to the point where releases are mundane. You shouldn't be freaking out over every single release. Let's get to the point where this is a really mundane thing that happens and it's rare for build errors to occur. This is a big one that I see across the board when it's time to buy a new tool and security team can't prove why they should. And one of the things that I see is security team hands their existing reports off to leadership, and you need to shift and say, you know what, I'm going to give you things that are tied to uptime, because leadership's going to care about uptime, reducing costs, or the number of SOC incidents. I'm going to boil everything down to business goals and cost, speed, risk, and efficiency, because that's what the business leadership is going to care about. They aren't going to care about the super like an SQL injection or cross-site scripting. They want to map that as risk to the business and quantifying that. You may be able to do that in a GRC or a BI tool. So when you're reporting to leadership, report on their level, meet them where they are, and deliver reports that are relevant to what they want to see, which would be cost, risk, speed, efficiency, uptime, those sort of things. I see lack of expertise in security departments all the time. Traditional vulnerability management's easy. You push out a patch, boom, it's fixed. AppSec is a completely different beast. It shouldn't be treated the same whatsoever. And development's a fast-moving environment compared to IT too. So security, if you don't understand what it is, then you can't. What it is you're trying to protect, there's no way you can protect it. I also see inefficient developers. The other flip side of this coin is developers don't know anything about security. They aren't educated about it. So when it comes time to issue a remediation, they have to rely on the security department to do that, to verify things and interpret the results of some sort of tool. Both sides need to meet each other in the middle and learn a bit about what the other side does. Put your developers in secure code training on an ongoing basis, not just one time, but twice a year, I think is the norm these days. Get people into there twice a year to where it's constantly in their head that, hey, this is really something that we have to do. Security teams, learn how to use Burp, learn basic cloud architectures, take a basic web app pen testing course, be able to validate these findings on your own and understand what they mean. What's the difference between a cross-site scripting attack and a reflected cross-site scripting attack? Be able to explain that to a 5-year-old. And if you're really lacking that expertise and you're not going to have it, consider managed services, consider staff augmentation or consultants. There's a variety of companies out there that can provide managed services or just bring someone on staff for like the next 6 months or 9 months that can take care of this for you. There's a variety of other things like our tools have that can help with this as well. So let's get to really the meat of things. So we've talked about problems that you guys are facing out there in the wild. I've talked about how to address them. Now let's step to like the most mature state, which is building a self-service DAST portal. So there's a couple, I divided things up into process changes and technical changes. So this is not going to happen overnight. My enterprise customers, this takes at least 1 year, if not 2 or 3, to get stood up and working. So if you start on it now and you start with new apps that are created, you can slowly onboard additional apps. The keys to making this successful, again and again, developers don't really understand or care about security. It would be great if we could make them. What we need is a simple button, an easy button that, hey, scan this app for me. Pass, fail. Okay, fail. Okay, what are the results? Pass. Okay, good. I'm going on with my day. Don't give them 500 findings that are low and informational. Filter all of that stuff out. We don't care. You're probably going to rely on unauthenticated scans as a first pass. Authentication is going to be getting authentication working at scale in an automated way is going to be something that is going to be in a later stages of development when you've got a really mature self-service portal. We do this with some of our enterprise customers also. Hey, get to know your vendor. Hey, you have this SAST tool or this DAST tool or this RASP tool. Get a close working relationship with them. Meet with their product team and dev team. Influence that roadmap and say, hey, here's the problems we're facing. Can you guys do this? And then we'll talk to other customers. You can also form coalitions. We see this. I see this in the West. I know of one that has a variety of cloud and operating system and social network providers, and they meet on a regular basis. So here's the tip. If you work in healthcare, get together with the other big healthcare providers and work with them. Say, hey, here's the problems that we're facing. Let's all tell the vendors about these same things. And you can even throw your weight around together and get vendors to do things and say, hey, the 5 of us giant hospital providers or healthcare providers, we're all going to send the same message to vendors. And we're going to get them to do this thing that we want them to do. And they'll kind of combine forces. So I'm aware that that's going on. And so partner even with your competitors. You guys are all on the same team in terms of securing the environment. On a technical basis, keep things as simple as possible. Don't give the full-blown interface with all the millions of options to your developers. Hide as much as possible. Give the least number of configure options. Here's the username. Here's the password. Here's the URL. Scan it. And keep things as simple as possible for your devs when they're on this self-service portal. Let them troubleshoot on their own. Give them access to logs. Give them live telemetry about what's going on and the scan status. Make it easy for them to test authentication without having to run a full scan. A full scan might take 20 minutes, 45 minutes. They may have typed in the password wrong. They may need to re-record the macro. Make it work in 30 seconds and let them test without having to run a whole scan. Reuse what QE, quality engineering, has already made. If you guys have Selenium scripts for QE stuff, hey, reuse them on your DAST tool and your IAST tool. And then you also need to give maps so that when a DAST tool runs and it scans an app, you need to hand that back to the developer to say, hey, here's what I mapped out. Does that match what you guys actually built? Did I cover the whole entire app? And then this was, I think, one of the last slides here is the self-service portal architecture. So workflow-wise, here's what's going to happen chronologically. The first thing is there's a new app. The devs or the app owners are going to fill out a questionnaire. They're going to go to a web application. You could start off as simple as Google Forms if you want to. You could build your own web app. Or the CI/CD pipeline discovers a new app. They're going to notify this web portal that you've built. This is going to be the master app catalog. This is going to be the tool that kind of controls your DAST engines and talks to a variety of AppSec products. It doesn't just have to be DAST. Now, if you've got a consolidated tech stack where everything is using 3 or 4 different authentication methods and 3 or 4 different JavaScript frameworks or languages, it's going to make this a lot easier because you can just say, hey, this is made with Angular, and then it can tell the DAST tool that, or hey, use this existing authentication macro. All the apps are using the same authentication method, so I can just reuse that macro for 150 different apps. So we can reuse that stuff and streamline efficiency so that when your tool talks to those DAST scan engines, it can simplify the configuration and kind of pull from an existing configuration, and the developers don't have to know how any of that works. They can just trigger scans by telling it, hey, here's the URL and here's what it's made with. Then after those scans finish, you're going to pass that information off to a variety of places. First, there might be some business intelligence tool like Microsoft Power BI or Tableau, and you can do your reporting up there. So that way you can have at enterprise scale large reporting that has trending, and you can split things up and tag different apps and say, I want to report on trending from business unit number 7. Show me all of that. And then you can customize things in the BI tool. Second, you'll probably pass things off to a CMDB like ServiceNow. And then that way you can populate your CMDB and have everything organized over there. When it comes time to certain vulns are found, and again, filter to just mediums and highs that are found, fire off tickets in Jira or ServiceNow or your ticketing system. And then maybe you do this inside of your web portal, or maybe your engines or your AppSec provider can generate these rules for you, but generate WAF rules. So you find, maybe you scan production and you don't have time to fix a vulnerability that was found. Well, what you can do is you can deploy a WAF rule that prevents exploitation of that. Now the vulnerability is still there, but we've got a Band-Aid over it, and it prevents the bad guys from actually exploiting it in the wild, while we can take probably the 2 weeks to a month to fix that vulnerability. So that wraps up all of the material.
I just got a question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, would you mind going back to that? Yeah, so I think we did enough prefacing of Not a lot of organizations can get to the point of doing this immediately, and it takes time. Based on your purview and what you've seen with customers, where does it make sense to start as far as integrating with outside systems, and what external systems do you see customers having a little bit of an easier time either integrating with or getting data out of?
Ticketing is the first to go, first two that you should integrate with. Meet developers where they are, so when it comes time to open up tickets, you don't want them to log into another tool. Fire off tickets in an automated way or have the security team review them before they go out and talk to ServiceNow or Jira or whatever your ticketing platform is. So that eases the remediation pain. The next one usually is CI/CD pipeline integration of I want to make this a part of my regular process. Then third, I usually start to see BI tool. AppSec isn't as far advanced as traditional vuln management is, and the scanning is still struggling, but so is the reporting across the industry. And so I usually see in the enterprise space, the next step is usually BI tools like Tableau to get better reporting. Like the networking company I'm talking to is struggling with that, and so they're implementing things through Tableau because they need 5 different levels of executive reporting. And then probably the CMDB, and then usually last is the WAF. Right. That would be the order I would do it in.
Yeah, there's some of those that you can do in tandem as well. CMDB is a great example of it, where you may not be ready to do it the full-blown CMDB. As part of what you're doing, starting to formulate what is that CMDB going to look like, right? When we talk about onboarding new apps and interviewing those developers, that's a great time to start to look at, okay, what information am I seeing that I need, right? And how do I then bring that into my CMDB to better understand what it means to be fully onboarded and what we need that. That CMDB really eventually becomes that real core center to that app catalog of what do we have out there, how do we interface with it, and how do we grow once we build on it. So just because you're not going to necessarily jump full blown into one of these, you don't have to shy away from, what do we need when we get ready for that? How can we start to build that as part of, our process that we're doing? So, I completely agree with what Tim said around kind of how people organically go, but keep in mind, some of those, it's great to use what you're already doing to preface and start to build the groundwork for when you're ready to do that next step.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. So I've just got some some key takeaways, and then we'll spend all the rest of the time in Q&A. So key takeaways: you're only successful as your leadership wants you to be. So you have to get C-levels on board with security. But conversely, security must really make an effort to understand how the business works and to support that, empathize with them. You can only protect what you know. You need to create a formal onboarding process, like I just mentioned about a form that feeds into an app catalog, or at least a spreadsheet or a CMDB. Frame everything that you're telling when you're a security person and you want someone else to change. Frame it in terms of how it's going to help them and the business. And we can only protect what we understand. So you need to keep up with the latest tech, and you meet developers where they are. You can't say, no, you guys aren't allowed to use Azure because I don't understand it. You need to learn Azure because that's the way that things are going. Last thing that I'll mention, I have written a variety of internal workshops here at Rapid7 that have been for new hires or people looking to up their AppSec games. But a variety of people, it's new. I come from the development background. I wrote a few web applications in my day. I wrote a variety of exercises, over 20, that walk you through something as simple as, my mom or my dad could start with right-clicking in Chrome and using inspect to see how HTTP communication works, and building your way up, learning Postman, using some Python commands. It starts with absolutely no knowledge, and then works your way towards troubleshooting DASTs or crawling single-page applications. And I just posted the link to that on my Twitter, so at Tim Honker on Twitter. And then I've got some GitHub repos that I'm publishing a bunch of stuff to, and I'll be publishing this to that soon. I'm thonker-r7 on GitHub. So with that, now it's time for Q&A.
Yeah, and I kind of pulled the group in the chat window here, but it seems like you did such a great job that everyone's already got it all figured out. So it might be a little bit of a shorter Q&A, but we'll give it a couple minutes in case people are trying to formulate their thoughts. But great job, Tim, and I know you put a lot of work into this, so really appreciate it, and Dave, really appreciate the time that both of you put into this. Bueller, going once, going twice. Don't be shy. It's a real friendly group here. All right. Well, we got one. Tim,
Yeah,
we have a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, we are recording this right now, and we will be publishing it somewhere. I'm not sure. Pete, do you know where it's going to be published?
I do not, but what I can do is anyone who registered for the webinar, I can have an automated email sent following up with a link to the recording. So we will definitely do that. All right. Well, thank you everyone for taking the time to talk to us today. It was a nice mix up for the day, get a little socialization, and I hope everyone's staying safe and healthy. And if there's anything that you need from a Rapid7 perspective, again, my name is Pete Martin. Feel free to find me on LinkedIn or email me at Peter_Martin at Rapid7, and I can make sure we get the right person to support you. And if it's something I can help with, even better. But with that, we will sign off. And again, everyone have a good rest of their day and a safe and healthy rest of the week.